will be a short overview on how to utilize the BCP card cutting template to actually cut a card, and some of the do's and don'ts to keep in mind during the process. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll be utilizing this recent article from The Hill on high-skilled immigration. This article has a lot of good parts. If you go to the article and read it, you'll note that the top part of the article is taking a harms or inherency-based approach towards Trump's actions for H-1B visas, while the bottom half offers some suggestions on how to reform the high-skilled immigration program. For the purposes of this video, we'll be cutting a card based upon the top half of the article, which concerns U.S. economic competitiveness. So we'll basically be starting from the top paragraph and we'll be going down all the way to here. One thing to keep in mind when cutting cards is that you always want to cut complete paragraphs. It's considered an ethical violation, for example, to stop your copying and pasting right here, and because usually the entire paragraph encapsulates the idea that you want to bring across. And so while it's fine to cut, especially long articles, halfway through, you want to make sure that you're taking all of the paragraphs in the process. So if we copy this part and paste it into our card cutting template, you'll note that a common mistake that people make when doing this is that they'll paste the article formatting as is. So you'll see a lot of cards with this font that does not match the font of the card cutting template, and that's because people don't utilize the shortcut that's built into the template to avoid this problem. So I believe that the keyboard shortcut to paste without formatting is F2, but you can also go up to the Edit menu in Microsoft Word and select Paste and Match Formatting, and that'll paste the card such that it matches the formatting of the template. The next thing you'll note is that this article has a lot of hyperlinks embedded within it that carry over into the template. And while this isn't necessarily a bad thing, they can get kind of distracting when reading the card, and it's also kind of annoying when you accidentally click on them and it brings you to a web page, or in this case, gives you a virus notification, and it's something that you don't want triggered. So on a Mac, an easy way to get rid of these hyperlinks is to simply select all the text and hit Command 6, and all the hyperlinks go away. The next thing you'll want to keep in mind is that the template that we've given you in Rhetoric gives you the option to condense all of the text in the article into one paragraph. I believe it's the F3 shortcut. So that is an option, and if you'd also prefer, you can keep the article as is with all of the different paragraph breaks. It's entirely up to you, but some people find that condensing all of the text makes it easier to A, fit more text on one page, and B, just makes it easier to read. So after you have the text of the article pasted into the template, the next thing you want to do is add a tag and a header. Technically, you can tag the card after you've finished cutting it, but I always like to tag my cards at the very beginning because then I know what I want to be focusing on when I'm actually cutting the card. So for here, a good short descriptive header is going to be, since it's a harms card, you want to label it with harms or H, and then a short dash. And then in this case, the main harm being addressed is economic competitiveness. So that's what I'm going to label the card as. Economic competitiveness. Also, while you're here, you can change up here. We have generally the default BCP 1819 name, file title, etc. Obviously, you want to contextualize those to whatever file you're cutting. So in this case, if I'm starting to cut a high-skilled immigration 1AC, then I'll want to change this to 1AC HSI, and whatever your last name is, or your partner's last name for Rhetoric. After you've done that, now you want to tag the card. So things to keep in mind when tagging cards is that they shouldn't be overly long and repeat too much of the card. So for example, if the card itself is 4 to 5 sentences, you don't want a 4 to 5 sentence tag. But at the same time, it shouldn't be super short and an incomplete sentence like high-skilled immigration undercuts growth, because that doesn't really help the judge understand what the card is trying to get across. Typically, a good compromise is a 1 to 2 sentence tag that gets across the main claim of whatever the card is trying to convey without giving away too much of the specific information in the card. So you wouldn't mention, for example, that 1 out of every 3.5 high-skilled workers in the United States are foreign-born, but one thing that you could say for the card tag is that, for example, the Trump administration is actively deterring high-skilled immigrants from coming to the United States that jeopardizes our position as the world's economic leader. That's a pretty good length tag. It's not perfect, but it does get the main point of the card across. The first sentence conveys what the Trump administration is currently doing for high-skilled immigrants, namely deterring them from coming to the United States. And the second position, or the second sentence rather, impacts that out and explains why it's important that we have high-skilled immigrants in the US. You can underline parts of the tag if you'd like. And then the next step after you've created your tag is to cite the card. Now, there's not one hard and fast rule for how to do cites, but there is some information that needs to be included in every cite, which is why I always do my cites the same way every time, so I make sure to include that information. So at the minimum, obviously you're going to want to include the full name of the author, a short description of the author's qualifications, and the date that the author wrote the article in the part that you actually read in around. So any citation will have two different parts to it. It's going to be the short, bolded, underlined part that you'll see in a lot of the BBBs that are basically, in this case, this article is written by William R. Kerr. The nice thing about The Hill is that it provides author qualifications for you at the bottom of the article. So in this case, we see that the author is a professor at Harvard Business School. And the article was fairly recent. It was written in September 29th, 2018. So that is the part of the site that you will actually bold to be read in round. The rest of it is just for reference, so that if the other team wants to question the evidence or look it up after the round, they have the ability to do so. So the rest of the information is usually included in parentheses next to the short, bolded, underlined citation. This, for me, usually includes the author's first name and middle initial, followed by a longer description of the author's qualifications after a semicolon. So I separate all of the information in the parenthetical citation utilizing semicolons. You can also do commas, which are perfectly fine. I just find that semicolons are easier. But after you've completed the author's name, you want to do a short Google search to find more author quals, because typically whatever site you are cutting the article from won't have all the qualifications, and you can get your evidence to seem more qualified if you look up the author qualifications outside. So if I do a Google search for William R. Kerr, I'll note that he's actually not only just a professor at Harvard Business School, he is a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. So I can include that. Obviously, you want to keep the same thing in mind, that if you're copying and pasting information into this template, you'll want to be utilizing either the keyboard shortcut or Microsoft Word's paste and match formatting option. None of the rest of this looks particularly important. Professor at Harvard University is more than sufficient to make up a qualified piece of evidence, but if you really want to go into it, you can go further into this site and look, for example, where he got his PhD from, etc. And you can do that for other pieces of evidence that might be staff writers, for instance, that have, for example, business degrees or other sorts of degrees that you can include in the short citation. After you've completed that, the next thing I do is restate the publication date of the article. Then after that, I include the title of the article. So this is just as simple as copying and pasting it into Word. And then the URL of the article, followed by the publication of the article. And then you also want to include the date accessed. So for today, it is Monday, October 2nd. And that's really all the information you need. The reason why it's so important to include the date accessed is because for some articles, particularly on recent articles, that information can change. And so the National Speech and Debate Association likes people to include the date accessed so that if there's a contradiction between what pieces of evidence say, that can usually be resolved by looking at who accessed the article more recently and whether information in that article changed in the interim. Get rid of the hyperlink there. And then once that citation is done, you can actually get to cutting the card. Now, usually what you do for cutting a card is you start with underlining it and then you actually get to highlighting it. General rule of thumb that you want to keep in mind when underlining is that you want to underline everything that's relevant. So people should be able to read just the underlined portions of the card and get a relevant or get a sense of the relevant context in the argument that the card is trying to convey. There's no hard and fast rule for what parts of the card you should bold, but generally you want to bold some things, phrases that you want to emphasize when speaking or basically saying the card in round. So start off underlining this card. You don't need to underline complete sentences. You can, but what I like to do is sometimes shorten what I underline. So instead of saying U.S. innovation is driven in no small part by high-skill immigrants, you can just say U.S. innovation is driven by high-skilled immigrants, which gets the same idea across. Keep in mind that the underlining and bolding macros in the default template that we give you are F9 and F10, but you can also go up here and use the style pane for any of this. So I could, for example, bold U.S. innovation using that, or I can use the F10 key. It gets the same point across. 1975, 1 out of every 12 investors in the U.S. was foreign-born. Now it is 1 out of every 3.5. That's an interesting statistic because it demonstrates the importance of foreign-born investors and immigrants to the U.S. economy, and the part about 1975 offers relevant context for that. So even if I were to only highlight the part that mentions 1 out of every 3.5 and say that in an actual round, if somebody were reading this card, it would be important to have the 1975 statistic for a relevant comparison. Now, the next sentence is an example of a sentence that doesn't really add much to your argument. If you remember that the argument you are trying to convey with this card is that the Trump administration is actively deterring high-skilled immigrants, which jeopardizes our position as the world's economic leader. Immigration's relevance to the midterm elections doesn't really relate much to that, so that's something that you can safely leave out of the underlining. Same thing for high-skilled immigration's role in the political debate. But the next sentence is interesting because it actively ties together the claim and the statistic about foreign-born immigration, and it ties that into America's economic prosperity. So long-term prosperity is a term that I could bold in this case because it's something that you want to emphasize when reading the card because it's something that's important to the card's main point. Many take our leadership in attracting global talent for granted. They assume high-skilled immigrants will always want to come to the U.S. to found Google or eBay companies built by immigrants. So this part of the card is talking about how the reason why U.S. leadership, both economically and through immigration, is fading is because of the Trump administration's policies that are deterring immigration or people from coming. So this card specifically indicts that thinking as being stuck in the 1990s. And today, the United States faces a decision whether it'll be continue to be the indisputable leader in attracting talent, or will it squander the gift? Now, the next part of the card is important because it compares U.S. economic growth and prosperity to other countries, specifically China and India. So the card says that by 2030, China and India will be home to 50% of the world's college graduates and 60% of STEM degree holders, in comparison to the United States, which presumably has less than that. This is powerful rhetoric, so maybe it's not the most important part to say in a round because it's not really presenting a statistic or new information. Oops. But it is something to keep in mind that the card is very powerfully phrased in this particular instance. We keep shooting ourselves in the foot with self-defeating rhetoric and misaligned policies. Foreign students come to the U.S. to study for work, but they are leaving the country in droves, deploying their knowledge and skills outside America. Now we get to how the U.S. immigration system relates to it, which is the inherency part of this card. The U.S. immigration system does not retain this talent effectively because the H-1B system has not meaningfully changed since its inception. Every year, the volume of applications outstrips the annual supply, which kneecaps our ability to bring in high-skilled workers and retain bright students. Now we get to the Trump administration's actions. This is probably sufficient. In fact, this is probably a bit over-underlined, but I wanted to do it for demonstration purposes, and also because this is a pretty good card. And depending on how you highlight it, you could get across multiple different claims. The card could be highlighted solely to demonstrate the importance of high-skilled immigration to the US economy, or it could be highlighted to create more of an inherency argument and talk about how the Trump administration is actively jeopardizing US economic competitiveness. So after we've underlined the card, the next thing we can do, well, you do have the option of shrinking the text, like you'll see in some of the BBBs. If you do that, and you also do that for the citation, keep in mind that you don't want to shrink it beyond size 8 font, because if you're printing this out, it's much harder for the other team to read the ununderlined portions of your evidence, which just makes you look sketchy in a bad way if they can't read the parts of the evidence that you don't want them to read. After you've done that, you can now highlight the card. You don't want to highlight too much, which is a major problem that we see in a lot of Rhetoric 1ACs that we receive. Generally, you want to be highlighting roughly 2 to 5 sentences or 25 to 75 words, depending on how good the card is. But the key is that these should be full grammatically correct sentences, not sentence fragments. So you shouldn't be highlighting things like, now it is 1 out of 3.5. This is dangerous for prosperity. They assume high-skilled immigrants will want to come. This is stuck in the 90s. Actually, you could just say stuck in the 90s. This is not what you want to do, because if you are reading this in round, it sounds super awkward to listen to these phrases that are completely taken out of context. It might be technically more efficient, and you might technically be getting the same amount of information out, but if you're reading it, it just sounds like, now it is 1 out of 3.5. This is dangerous for prosperity. They assume high-skilled immigrants will want to come. This is stuck in the 90s. As a judge, that doesn't mean anything, so it defeats the entire purpose of reading the evidence, which is to use experts to back up the claims that you are trying to make. If the judge isn't comprehending what you want the evidence to say, then it defeats the whole purpose of highlighting. The whole purpose of highlighting is just to get the key claims across in a concise and efficient, yet descriptive manner. So that's why highlighting cards are very important. You want to keep in mind what claims that you do want to highlight. I would probably start highlighting this card by using the first sentence. U.S. innovation is driven by high-skilled immigrants. Many take leadership in attracting global talent for granted, but by 2030, China and India will be home to 60% of STEM degree holders. We keep shooting ourselves in the foot with misaligned policies. Students are leaving in droves. The H-1B system has not meaningfully changed since its inception. The volume of applications outstrips the supply. Trump administration's actions make it harder to bring in high-skilled workers. So that was my first run through of highlighting the card. I look at it afterwards and I see, well, this is a bit over-highlighted, and I probably don't need all of these words to convey that same argument. So I can probably take out some of these words. U.S. innovation is driven by high-skilled immigrants. That's probably an important claim to make. Many take our leadership in attracting global talent for granted. That's implied by the next sentence, so I don't really need that. By 2030, China and India will be home to 60% of STEM degree holders. We keep shooting ourselves in the foot with misaligned policies. Students are leaving in droves. The H1B program has not changed since its inception. That's an instance where you can safely take out that word in the sentence because meaningfully is just a descriptive adverb that doesn't really add anything or lend to the judge's comprehension. The volume of applications outstrips the supply. The Trump administration's actions make it harder to bring in high skilled workers. That's probably good highlighting for this card. We saw an example of over highlighting before. Under highlighting would be taking out. If you did this, it'd probably be considered under highlighted because this really, you're getting the bare minimum across, but it would just be better if you added those additional couple sentences. It might take up a little more time, but you do ultimately get a more descriptive card out of it. Most common formatting errors we'll see are usually inconsistent fonts, underlining, or citation formatting. Not entirely sure why these errors pop up, because if you follow the general formatting guidelines as outlined in this video, there should be no need to have inconsistent fonts or inconsistent font sizes throughout your document. For some reason, though, every single time we get card submissions for rhetoric, we'll see things like things randomly bolded and italicized. There will be parts of cards that are in different fonts, like I'm sure like the bottom part of this card could be an Arial. The site in particular is usually completely out of line. It'll be size 13 font. It'll be underlined or something like that. And so technically these cards are still readable in round, but it's just so much neater to have your evidence all underlined and highlighted with the same consistent formatting each time. And it makes it much nicer for other teams to read your evidence as well. So if you follow the general guidelines that were outlined in this video, you should have no problem cutting your cards in such a way as that they maintain that consistent style of formatting. And ultimately, if you follow the template, you shouldn't have any problems, and you should have your cards looking just like this or just like the ones in the BBVs.